August 31st, 2013. 4 a.m., Fort Collins, Colorado. A police officer responded to a call at Cottonwood Glen Park. What he found there is something he has described as one of the worst scenes he has ever encountered in his career. A young woman, naked, bound with red duct tape, around her head, covering her eyes and her mouth, around her hands, around her feet. She had a broken jaw, a bleed on her brain. One of her eyes was nearly swollen completely shut. She was barely conscious, but she was alive, and she was screaming. Her name was Amber Smith. She was 20 years old. She was a single mother. And the man who had done this to her had just walked away into a city where he would remain invisible for the next 4 years. But here's the part of this story that no one saw coming. The part that, when you hear it, will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Amber Smith eventually recovered. She rebuilt her life, piece by piece. She found a group of friends who offered her a safe place to heal. She moved in with them. She made new connections. And somewhere in that circle of people, someone she came to trust, someone she confided in, someone who sat with her while she talked about the worst night of her life, was the man who had been there. The man who put the duct tape on her face. The man who broke her jaw. The man who left her for dead. Let's go back to the beginning. Amber Smith was a 20-year-old living in Fort Collins in the summer of 2013. She was working at a local 7-Eleven, raising her son Gabriel on her own, trying to build something stable from very little. By most measures, she was doing what young, single mothers do, managing an impossible schedule with whatever energy she had left at the end of each day. On the night of August 30th, 2013, Amber took a night off. She went to Rossboro Park with her friend, Eric Vanagunas. They had some drinks. Amber had more than she realized. At some point during the evening, she fell asleep at a picnic table. She remembers very little of what happened next. The fragments she does have are haunting. A rope across her neck, screaming, trying to break free, being struck, fighting, because of her son, she said, because she could not stop thinking about Gabriel. At some point, she lost consciousness. When police found her in the early morning hours of August 31st at Cottonwood Glen Park, she had been bound, left exposed, and was barely alive. What the investigation uncovered was unambiguous. She had been beaten. She had been strangled. She had been violated in the worst way a person can be. The red duct tape binding her was covered in evidence. DNA was recovered from her body, from the tape, from her neck, from everywhere her attacker had left a trace. There was no question about what had happened. The only question was, who? Investigators moved fast. The violence of the attack suggested someone capable of extreme aggression. Someone who may have done something like this before. The DNA evidence was immediately processed and run through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database used to cross-reference forensic evidence against the profiles of individuals previously convicted or arrested for felonies. The result came back. No match. Whoever had done this to Amber Smith had never been in that database. He had no prior record that put him in the system. He was, as far as the forensic trail was concerned, invisible. Eric Vanagunas, the friend Amber had been with that night, cooperated fully. He gave his DNA voluntarily. He was ruled out immediately. Investigators worked every angle they had. They looked at known offenders in the area. They checked for similar attacks. They interviewed neighbors, park regulars, anyone who might have seen something. Nothing. I just felt sick, the lead detective, Siobhan Seymour, later recalled. How do we not have a suspect? Who is this guy? Where is he? The case went cold. Now let's talk about what happens to a person after something like this. When the system tells you it can't find who did it and essentially asks you to wait. Amber Smith went home to her son. She went back to her life. But the life she went back to was not the one she had left. The attack had restructured everything. She described being afraid to leave the house. She described scanning every face she passed, wondering. She described blaming herself for being at the park, for drinking, for falling asleep. The self-blame that trauma produces in assault survivors is one of the cruelest aspects of it. The brain, in trying to find logic in something that has no logic, often turns inward. If I had done something differently, this wouldn't have happened, as though the responsibility belonged anywhere other than with the man who bound her hands with duct tape and walked away. She slipped into depression. She struggled. She kept going because of Gabriel, because that's what you do when someone else needs you to survive. By 2015, 2 years after the attack, a friend offered her a room in a shared house, a safe place, somewhere she could be around people, rebuild something that resembled normalcy, keep moving forward. She took it, and that's where she met Stefan Moon. Stefan Alexander Moon was 32 years old in 2013. He lived in Fort Collins. He was, by all external appearances, a quiet and considerate person. The kind of roommate who noticed when you were having a hard day, who asked if you were okay, who made himself available. When Amber moved into the shared house and the topic of her assault came up, as it inevitably did, Stefan Moon was sympathetic. He was, by Amber's own account, one of the most supportive people in that house. He would sit with her when she needed to talk. He would ask if she wanted a hug. He would tell her, "I'm so sorry. You should never have had to go through that." Amber trusted him. She told him details about the attack. She told him about the duct tape. She told him about the rope around her neck. She told him about how hard she had fought because she was thinking about her son. He listened. He nodded. He expressed horror and compassion. And somewhere behind those expressions, he already knew every single detail she was telling him. Because he had been there. Because he was the one who had done it. Sit with that for a moment. By 2017, Amber had moved out of the shared house and into her own small apartment with Gabriel. She was putting things back together. The case was still cold. Stefan Moon was still in Fort Collins, still living his life, still completely undetected. Then in the summer of 2017, Stefan Moon was arrested for stealing a bicycle from a friend and attempting to pawn it. A minor offense, the kind of thing that might result in a fine, a short sentence, a footnote. But when you are arrested in the state of Colorado, your DNA is collected, and that DNA goes into a database. And sometimes a database knows something the rest of the world doesn't. In August 2017, nearly 4 years to the day of the attack, investigators received notification that the DNA taken from Stefan Moon at the time of his arrest had been flagged as a match. Not for a minor theft. Not for anything that pointed to who he appeared to be on the surface. It matched the DNA recovered from Amber Smith's body in 2013. From the duct tape, from her neck, from the forensic evidence that had been sitting in storage for 4 years, waiting for a name to attach itself to. The name was Stefan Moon. Detective Siobhan Seymour had worked Amber's case since 2013. She had never let it go. When the DNA match came back, she later described feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her. She also had to make one of the hardest calls imaginable. She had to tell Amber Smith that the man who had raped her, beaten her, bound her with duct tape, and left her for dead in a public park was someone Amber already knew. Someone Amber had called a friend. Someone who had hugged her while she talked about what he had done. When Amber was shown a photograph of Stefan Moon and told who he was, the impact was devastating in a way that is almost impossible to articulate. The betrayal layered on top of the original trauma. The realization that every conversation she had with him about the attack, every expression of sympathy, every offer of comfort, had been a performance. A calculated act of manipulation by a man who had already taken so much from her and was now taking something else. Her ability to trust her own perception of safety. Before the arrest, investigators arranged a pretext call. This is a controlled, recorded phone call where a victim contacts the suspect, with police listening, in an attempt to elicit a confession or at least a damaging statement. It's a technique that requires extraordinary courage from the person making the call. Amber made that call to Stefan Moon. She confronted him. She told him what investigators had found. His response, captured on that recording, was, "What? Oh my God, Amber. I don't know what to say. I did not hurt you." Not a denial delivered with confidence. Not the response of a person shocked by a false accusation. A stumbling, fragmented reaction from someone whose story was collapsing in real time. Moon was arrested in August 2017. When investigators searched Moon's digital history, what they found was not the profile of a man who had acted impulsively on one terrible night. His search history was full of material related to non-consensual acts, a pattern of consumption that painted a picture of someone who had been cultivating a particular kind of violence in his mind long before August 31st, 2013. In interrogation, Moon told investigators his own version of events. He claimed that he had, in fact, had sex with Amber that night, but that it was consensual. He claimed she had posted an ad on Craigslist offering casual sex, that he had responded to the ad, and that everything that followed was in agreement between two adults. When investigators subpoenaed Craigslist records, no such post existed. Not only that, but Moon then tried to redirect suspicion onto a childhood friend named Bryce, essentially attempting to frame someone else for the crime while investigators were sitting across from him with his DNA in their hands. It didn't work. Moon was charged with attempted first-degree murder after deliberation, second-degree kidnapping, 2 counts of sexual assault with a weapon, and first-degree assault causing serious bodily injury with a deadly weapon. He pleaded not guilty to all of it. The trial began in 2019. By this point, Amber Smith had carried this case for 6 years. 6 years of no answers, followed by an answer so disturbing it required processing on a level most people will never be asked to access. She had agreed to cooperate with investigators. She had made the pretext call. She had agreed to testify. She was going to sit in a courtroom and face the man who had left her bound and naked in a park and tell a jury exactly what he had done. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Brian Hardwin, built their case around the DNA evidence, the duct tape, the injuries, the digital history, the failed Craigslist alibi, the attempt to blame Bryce, the pretext call, and Moon's fractured response. The defense argued for the minimum possible sentence, 48 years to life. They did not succeed in dismantling the core evidence. The DNA was irrefutable. The Craigslist story had no supporting documentation. Moon's digital search pattern made it impossible to claim this was a moment of poor judgment rather than an expression of something deliberate and predatory. The jury deliberated, and then they came back with a verdict that, in one specific way, still does not sit right. Stefan Moon was found guilty of 2 counts of sexual assault, second-degree kidnapping, and first-degree assault. But on the charge of attempted first-degree murder, the charge that reflected what the physical evidence said had actually happened to Amber Smith that night, he was acquitted, not guilty. The woman had a broken jaw, a bleed on her brain. She had been strangled and left bound and naked and unconscious in a park at 4 in the morning. And a jury decided that did not meet the threshold for attempted murder. The detective who had worked the case for 6 years described the shock that went through the courtroom in that moment. But here is where this case makes you hold 2 contradictory truths at the same time. Because on the attempted murder charge, the most serious charge, Stefan Moon walked away with an acquittal that no reading of the physical evidence can fully justify. But on everything else, the sexual assault, the kidnapping, the assault, he was convicted. And the judge who presided over sentencing, Judge Brinegar, made something very clear when she addressed the court during the sentencing phase. She said, "This is certainly an unfathomable case. This is the only justice that can come out of this, the maximum sentence." Stefan Moon received 128 years to life in prison. He is currently incarcerated at the Colorado Territorial Correctional Facility. He will almost certainly die there. Let's talk about what Detective Siobhan Seymour did after the verdict. She started a GoFundMe for Amber Smith. She raised over $5,000, surpassing the original goal. The money was intended to fund Amber's certification in addiction counseling, a path Amber had chosen because she wanted to work with other survivors, with people who had been through something that made the world feel permanently unsafe, with people who needed someone to sit across from them and say, "I understand what it is to be in that place, and I am still here." Seymour said later that testifying in that trial felt like fighting for a sister, that the pressure to get it right was unlike anything she had experienced, that she carried Amber's case for 6 years because she believed it deserved to be solved. She was right. Amber Smith spoke publicly after the verdict. She said she felt more at peace. She said she felt like she could finally move forward. But here is what I want you to understand about that statement. Because moving forward after something like this is not the same as it being over. It's not the same as the damage being undone. It's not the same as 6 years of fear and depression and self-blame being erased by a sentencing hearing. Amber Smith told interviewers that she still gets migraines, that she still has anxiety, that her mind races at night because the attack happened at night, and her nervous system has never fully separated the hour from the danger. Gabriel, her son, the one she said she fought for while she was being strangled in that park, is still growing up. She is still his mother. She is still building a life. She is in a relationship. She is pursuing her certification. She is, by every measure, someone who refused to be permanently defined by the worst thing that ever happened to her. But the worst thing still happened. And the man who did it spent 4 years living freely in the same city. Spent 2 of those years sitting across from her in a shared living room, listening to her describe what he did, and saying, "I'm so sorry. You should never have had to go through that." There is something important to name here that this case illustrates with unusual clarity. Predators who attack strangers are often imagined as visibly dangerous, as people you would recognize, as someone who reads as a threat before they act as one. Stefan Moon was the opposite of that. He was soft-spoken. He was considerate. He made himself useful and present in the lives of people around him. He built trust deliberately over time, using the empathy and the trauma of the person he had already victimized as the foundation. That is not a profile of opportunistic violence. That is something far more calculated. And it tells you something about why the people who are most dangerous are so rarely the ones who seem dangerous. Because the performance of safety is its own skill. Stefan Moon had apparently been practicing it for years. The attempted murder acquittal still matters. It needs to be said directly. The jury looked at a woman who had been beaten to the point of a brain bleed, strangled, bound, and left unconscious in a park, and decided, with those facts in front of them, that the man who did it did not intend to kill her. That verdict lives alongside the 128-year sentence as the final shape of this case. It is not clean. It is not a complete accounting of what Amber Smith's body went through that night. And it is the kind of outcome that survivors who go through the trial process are rarely prepared for. Because the system does not guarantee that every element of what was done to you will be legally recognized, even when the evidence is right there. The conviction on the remaining counts, the maximum sentence, and the work of one detective who spent 6 years refusing to let a case go cold forever, those things matter too. They are not nothing, but they exist in the same frame as that acquittal. Amber Smith said something in an interview that I have not been able to stop thinking about. She said, "There was a time when nobody told me I was going to be okay." She survived the attack. She survived the cold case. She survived learning that she had befriended her attacker. She survived making that phone call to him while investigators listened. She survived the trial. She survived the mixed verdict. She is still here. Gabriel is still growing up. She is still his mother. And she has made the decision to use all of that, not to disappear, not to let it be the last thing she ever talks about, but to reach back toward people who are still in the part of the story where nobody has told them it's going to be okay. Stefan Moon is in a Colorado prison where he will spend the rest of his life. Amber Smith is in Fort Collins. She is still here, and she is still talking. If this case hit different, if it made you think about who you trust and why, make sure you are subscribed to Sealed Verdict. Every verdict we cover is a case the justice system didn't finish. Every story we tell is one that deserves to be heard. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you in the next verdict, just like this one.